So, hi everybody, and welcome to our neuroscience seminar. Today I'm very happy to introduce Christopher Summerfield, who has kindly accepted the invitation from students and postdocs at IST to give a talk in our seminar. And about him, Chris studied psychology and neurological science at UCL, and then moved to Columbia University to get his PhD with Joy Hirsch and Jennifer Mankels, that was awarded in 2005, and then moved to Paris to get a postdoc with Etienne Coughlin. And then afterwards moved to Oxford as an assistant professor in 2008, where he currently is. He and his group are interested in the neural and computational basis of learning and decision-making, both in humans and in neural networks. And in particular, he's using insights from deep learning to understand things about the brain, and on the other way around, like also insights from neuroscience to improve on existing artificial implementations. And these, among the others, is the topic of today's talk, which I and we are all very much looking forward to hearing. And with this, I want to thank you again, Chris, on behalf of all the students and postdocs here from IST Austria, and the stage is yours.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much, Michele, and thank you everyone at the IST for inviting me. It's only my only regret is that I can't be there in person in Vienna. It's one of my favorite cities in the whole world, but another time. So before beginning, I'm going to just acknowledge the wonderful people that contributed to this project. And I particularly want to shout out to Timo Flesch, who's a PhD student with myself and Andrew Saxe, who's done the vast majority of the work I'm going to talk about today. And I also want to mention Andrew in particular, who's really co-lead on all of the projects I'm going to mention, and especially also David Nagy, who is in Gergo Orban's lab in Budapest, and who has made a really substantial contribution, as well as many other lab members that are shown on this slide. So humans live long lives, and over the course of their lifetimes, they learn a lot of stuff. And in particular, they learn to do a lot of stuff. And in machine learning and AI research, this phenomenon is sometimes called lifelong learning or continual learning. And understand how humans are able to do this, in particular, how they're able to layer new learning upon old learning, is a grand challenge in machine learning. And it's also a grand challenge in neuroscience to understand the computational mechanisms that make that possible and their neural implementation in the brain. And that's going to be the topic of my talk today. Now, my title involves the word task, so I thought it would be worth just defining what I mean by task before we get started. So I'm going to define a task as a set of desired sensory motor mappings in a given context. So for example, different tasks might involve mapping a particular input, such as this musical notation here, onto a particular motor output pattern, such as that which is engaged in when you're either playing the violin or playing the piano. And we know that task learning critically involves the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, it involves in humans and primates, in particular, it involves the lateral portion of the dorsal prefrontal cortex. And we know that because if you have damage to that region, then you tend to get confused and you behave in task inappropriate or context inappropriate fashion, as we know, we've known for many decades from the classic work of people like Tim Challis. So today in my talk, I'm really going to study two specific questions, and these are articulated here. So the first is, how do neural representations form as agents, and by agents I mean either neural networks or biological agents, learn new tasks? So what is the representational learning process that occurs during task learning? And as a kind of preview, what I'm going to suggest that neural networks and potentially humans can either learn in one of two regimes, which Timo, Andrew, and I call the rich or the lazy regime. And I'm going to show evidence that humans learn in what we call the rich regime, which is slower and more structured, but more robust and potentially better for generalizing. And secondly, I'm going to talk about continual learning, and I'm going to ask how we humans are able to learn continually and avoid catastrophic interference. And I'm going to argue that unlike neural networks, humans particularly benefit when there is temporal autocorrelation in the training structure. In other words, where some training samples are not selected IID or in an interleaved fashion. And I'm going to describe a theory of how that works and how we avoid catastrophic interference. And that theory is going to involve a mixture of supervised and unsupervised learning. Okay, so the task that I'm going to use is a version of a familiar task, which is sometimes known as the context-dependent decision task. And here is a depiction of this task in a classic paper from Valerio Mante and David Cicillo a few years ago. And in their hands, the task was to perform one of two possible discrimination judgments on a stimulus, which was defined, it was some moving dots, which were defined either by their color or their direction of motion. And their participants were monkeys, and those monkeys were able to learn to perform this task as shown by the steeper psychometric functions for the relevant than the irrelevant dimension in each context. And in that paper, they showed, I think really, really importantly, that you were able to nicely model the neural dynamics that they recorded from the prefrontal cortex using a class of recurrent neural network. So in our hands, the task is a little bit different. Our participants are not monkeys, they're humans. And our stimuli are not moving dots, but they're trees. And the task that participants are going to do is they're going to view a tree. Sorry, I don't know. Can you see my cursor? Can someone nod if you can see my cursor? Yeah, you can. Great. Okay, so they're going to view a tree, and they're going to view that tree in one of two different contexts, which we're going to call the north garden and the south garden, which are visually distinctive. And the decision that they're going to make is whether to plant that tree or not. And the feedback that they get, rather like in the Mante task, is going to depend upon the context. So in one context, the context of the north task or north garden, then whether they get positive or negative feedback for planting the tree is going to depend upon whether the tree is more or less leafy. And that literally means whether the image of the tree contains more sort of green foliage or less. And in the other garden, it's going to depend upon whether the tree is more branchy or not. And that's going to be kind of, the degree, that's basically the branching factor of the tree stimulus. These stimuli are procedurally generated. We have a nice tool that makes these trees so we can generate trial unique stimuli, and we can perfectly control the degree of leafiness and branchiness that participants experience on each trial. So just like in the Mante-Cicillo experiment, we can see participants learn well-behaved psychometric functions. These are from different conditions, which I'm going to explain a little bit later. And you can see that participants' probability of planting the tree is proportional to its leafiness in one of the contexts and its branchiness in the other context. And just like in the Mante task, there's a mild intrusion from the irrelevant dimension after training. Now, the question that I want to ask, unlike in the Mante study, is I want to ask how, not just what the neural dynamics are like once the participants are trained, but I want to ask what is going to change in the neural representations over the course of training. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to expose participants to this task for a short period of time at the beginning of the experiment. Then we're going to give them a long training session, and then we're going to expose them again at the end of the experiment. And actually, we're going to record fMRI data at the end of the experiment as well, and I'll come to that later. And so my question is, first of all, do participants get better over the course of training? Of course, we hope that they do. And then secondly, I'm going to ask, how do participants get better over the course of training? In other words, specifically, what is it that allows them to get better? What do they learn whilst they're being trained? And so what I'm plotting here on the left is you can see the accuracy between the initial pre-session and post-session improves by about 25%, so a reasonably substantial improvement. But perhaps surprisingly, if we look at those measures of those psychometric measures of performance, that's the slope of the psychometric function for the relevant dimension, and bias, so potentially participants biased to respond one way or the other. Neither of those change at all over the course of learning, or change significantly over the course of learning. So what is it that's going on? Well, another way of characterizing performance is by plotting out the full choice matrix in each context as a function of the two dimensions, right? So the leafiness or branchiness of each of the stimuli. And so that's what's plotted on the left here. And you can see that broadly, this is what I'm showing here is actually after training. Broadly, after training, participants' probability of planting a tree respects the relevant dimension. So you can see that, for example, in the north garden, their probability of planting depends upon leafiness but not branchiness, and vice versa for the south garden. But what you can also see is that there is a kind of angle which characterizes the best fitting category boundary that participants are using to perform the task. And so although broadly their decisions are axis aligned after training, there's some kind of error in the category boundary that they're using. And we can characterize the change in that error from the beginning of the experiment to the end of the experiment. And what we see is that that changes really, really substantially. And here it's actually plotted in assigned fashion. But if you look at the dispersion of the points in the pre-condition relative to the post-condition, you can see that that angular error diminishes substantially, indicative of the fact that people are essentially learning what the relevant dimensions are and how to cleave them in order to perform the task. So broadly, what this tells us is that what's driving the improvement in performance is representation learning. And so in the rest of my talk, what I'm going to try to do is to understand how representations change over the course of training, and try to model that at the computational level. So we already have an inkling from lots of past work that different representational schemes in this type of task might confer different costs and benefits. So we know from the seminal work of people like Stefano Fusi and Earl Miller that, for example, high-dimensional representations confer an important benefit, which is that they can be efficiently read out, for example, by a simple linear decoding process. Whereas low-dimensional representations have a different benefit, which is that because they involve a bit of redundancy, they tend to be more robust, both robust to noise and potentially to confer better generalizability, because it's easier to effectively match representations across equivalent conditions. And so one thing we can ask is, in the context of learning, how might we even acquire these different sorts of high-dimensional or low-dimensional representations, and which of these representational schemes is most likely to support the emergence of the behaviors that we saw in humans. So in order to tackle this problem, what we're going to do is we're going to take an even simpler example. And here we're taking a leaf. What we're doing, and this I should point out, is work that's primarily done by Andrew in his group. It's deeply relevant to what I'm talking about today. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a leaf out of contemporary deep learning theory, and we're going to try to understand the two different regimes in which neural networks learn to perform a very, very simple task, in this case, a simple XOR classification task. So I've depicted the task up here. The task is to classify these stimuli shown on the top here into two categories, which are defined by either the red cross or the blue circle. And as we know, this is an XOR problem, so this can't be solved with a single linear boundary. So we need a nonlinear classification. We need some kind of tool capable of nonlinear classification in order to solve this problem, like a deep neural network or a neural network with a hidden layer. And so what we're going to do is we're going to consider how a neural network learns this problem, and we're going to take the simplest possible form of neural network that can solve this problem. So this is one with just simply two input units. And what this is going to allow us to do is to model what the sorts of representations that form under two different conditions. And those two different conditions which we're going to explore are the different, where either the initial scaling of the weights in the neural network is low, that is where all the weights are initialized to relatively low values, or whether they're initialized to reasonably high values. So if we begin with the case in which the weights are initialized with a large scale, then what we can see is that the neural network learns a relatively unstructured solution. So what we're plotting here, what I'm plotting here on the left, are the different weight vectors. So essentially just the different patterns of input received by each hidden unit from the two input units on the X, here plotted on the X and the Y axis. And what you can see is that there's a great heterogeneity in those input vectors. On the right, what I'm plotting is the learning dynamics, which for a simple problem like this, using something like the neural tangent kernel, you can actually compute analytically. And what you can see is that the learning dynamics are actually exponential. So the network is learning really, really rapidly, learning towards convergence really, really rapidly. What we can also, so this type of learning is characterized not just by these exponential trajectories and this kind of unstructured similarity or unstructured similarity in the weights or in the patterns that are learned, but also as you can see, the solution that the network eventually arrives at is going to be both low sparsity and high norm, right? So we're going to have, essentially large weights characterizing the eventual solution. Now we can counterpoint that with what happens if we begin by initializing our weights to have relatively low variance. And we can see that now, instead of learning this highly unstructured solution, we learn a really, really structured solution in which really, essentially the inputs are just pointing essentially in 4 directions, which make up their directions corresponding actually to the 4 stimuli, which end up having to be classified. And we can see also that in complete contrast to what we learn in under high initial weight scale, here we have sigmoidal learning trajectories, and we end up with low norm, high sparsity solutions that are very, very tailored to the specific task that is being performed. And so we're going to call these two classes of solution, qualitatively different classes of solution, respectively, lazy learning and rich learning. And we use the term lazy learning because what's characteristic of the top solution, the lazy solution, is that really the input weights don't actually have to change all that much over the course of learning. Essentially what you have, because you already have a high norm solution, you already have a high dimensional solution, that you can really just learn an appropriate decoder, rather like the high dimensional solution alluded to in the Fuzzy work. You can just learn a high dimensional, you can just learn a simple linear readout in order to solve the task. And there's no need to learn a structured representation. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this principle and we're going to apply it to a neural network which is learning to solve our context-dependent decision task. And the way we're going to set up that neural network is, I think, just about as simple as it's possible to do to solve the task. So we're going to have 2 input units which correspond to either the north or the south garden, so that's the context. And then we're going to have a set of input units that just code for the magnitude on each of the 2 dimensions, so the level of leafiness and the level of branchiness. And we're going to have some hidden units, and the network is just going to learn to do exactly what humans do, which is just to respond either accept or plant or reject or don't plant. And it's going to be trained with in a supervised setting with gradient descent. So rather than using the more complicated tree stimuli, which would kind of involve us learning, having a more elaborate front end to the neural network, what we're going to do is we're going to use instead we're going to use relatively stylized inputs. So our inputs are going to be these Gaussian blob images in which the actual dimensions of the stimulus, rather than being the leafiness and branchiness of the tree, are actually just it's effectively the X and Y location of the centroid of a blob, which is represented in this image. But to all intents and purposes, you can think of it as the same as the trees task, which humans are performing. Okay, so here is some simulation data. So we would expect, from what we know previously, would expect that in the lazy regime, that is when the input weights are initialized to have high norm, we would expect the learning to be faster, and that is indeed the case. So here what I'm showing, I'm sort of sweeping across different initial weight scale. from essentially from the rich solution shown in orange right through to the lazy solution, sorry, the rich solution shown in purple right through to the lazy solution shown in orange. And what you can see is that the lazy solution learns much faster. So I'm plotting here number of episodes to convergence on the left. But in the two plots on the right, what we can also see is that the lazy solution is more vulnerable to either to compression, right? So if we just simply remove components, we lower the dimensionality of the solution, then that's much more detrimental to the performance of the lazy network than the rich network. And similarly, if we add Gaussian noise to the inputs, then there's a much greater tolerance under the rich, in the rich regime than in the lazy regime. So here we have exactly this trade-off, which we've alluded to before, between high dimensional and low dimensional solutions. The high dimensional solutions are fast and efficient, but low dimensional solutions are tolerant to noise and to potentially to other perturbations. Okay, so now let's look at the neural geometry. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the activations in the hidden units, which are recorded in response to each of the stimuli. And we're going to perform multidimensional scaling to project them into here just a three-dimensional space, plotting out the relationship between dimensions 1 and 2 and dimensions 1 and 3. And we're going to do that for networks which are trained in the extreme. So one at the extreme of the lazy regime, and the other at this extreme of the rich regime. So if we focus first on the neural geometry that's learned in the lazy regime, what we can see is that effectively it learns a kind of grid-like structure, which essentially recapitulates the input structure of these stylized Gaussian blobs, or if you like, of the leafiness and branchiness structure of the tree stimuli, which we sampled for our humans. And if you think about it, that's expected, and that's because random high-dimensional projections tend to preserve distances among inputs. So essentially what's happening in the lazy regime is that we're recapitulating the input space. But if you look in the, and sorry, I should explain here that here I've used, or rather Timo has used, the color of these dots here to signal one dimension and the size of the dots to signal another dimension. So you can think of blue to green as leafiness and small to large as branchiness, for example. And the orange and blue are showing the two contexts. And so the grid in each context is effectively lying one on top of the other. They're lying one on top of the other in the input space, or in the hidden unit space. But if we move over to the right and we look at what's happening in the rich regime, we see that, just as expected from the XOR example, the representations, the neural geometry, which is learned, is highly structured. And specifically, what's being learned is that the representations of each dimension are being compressed onto two kind of orthogonal planes. These planes effectively lie as a sort of cross in this low-dimensional representational space, with one of these planes for each context. So what you can see is that in one context, so for example in the North Garden, there's elongation along the relevant axis and compression along the irrelevant axis. And in the other context, we have the same, but there's elongation along the other axis, which is now, of course, the one that's relevant in this context. And what we can see is that these two planes lie really nicely at 90 degrees to one another, with just a small offset in the third dimension. So one way of thinking about this is, so effectively that what the neural network has learned in the rich regime is it's a factorized representation. So it's learned to essentially to factorize the input space according to the two relevant dimensions. And we can quantify that a bit more carefully by fitting RDMs, representational dissimilarity matrices, to the neural geometry. And we can see that as we increase the initial weight scale, you go from something that looks more grid-like to something that looks more plane-like to something that looks more grid-like. Okay, so as I mentioned, so this is all simulation, right? And so what I think we've done so far is we've identified two different regimes in which neural networks can learn. And what this effectively allows us to do is then to pose the question, well, in biological systems, what are biological systems doing? Which of these two regimes are they learning in, and how are they solving the context-dependent decision tasks? So what we have is we have bold data from humans, and in actual fact, this is collected from the post phase that I referred to earlier. So this is when participants are already trained to do the task. And of course, this is the trees task, the actual trees task. And what we can ask is, what does the neural geometry look like in humans who have learned to perform this task? And training here is in this, just like in the Mante task, in this fully interleaved fashion where they're receiving, context randomly from trial to trial. And we're going to focus on some different brain regions. So we can focus on some regions in early visual cortex, and also some higher association regions in the parietal and prefrontal cortices. And I'm happy to talk about that choice later on. So if we look in early visual cortex, what we see is something that's highly reminiscent, if you like, of the lazy regime. So what we have is in EVC, a recapitulation of the input structure. So in other words, the similarity of each of the similarity structure amongst the trees that participants are seeing is essentially a reasonably well defined by the similarity, their true similarity structure in the space the space of leafiness and branchiness, which we defined a priori. So in other words, something that looks like a projection of the input space. But if we move to the higher association regions, and we look particularly in this lateral prefrontal region here, and also in this parietal region here, what we can see is something that really looks exactly like we see in the hidden units of neural networks, which are trained under the rich regime. So we see a projection of the inputs onto two beautifully orthogonal planes, and within each of these planes, we see compression along whichever of the feature dimensions was irrelevant in that context, and an elongation along whichever dimension was relevant in that context. And so we see something which really looks like exactly like the structured representation which is learnt in the neural networks. So you might be saying, okay, well, that's a pleasing correspondence, but how do we know that this type of factorized representation actually has anything to do with the learning or the behavioral performance that participants exhibit during the task? It might just be complete happenstance that they form this type of neural geometry, and actually doesn't subserve their behavior in any way whatsoever. But if we actually look across our participant cohort, we have about 30 participants, and if we look at the correlation between the degree of behavioral task factorization and the degree of neural task factorization in either the prefrontal or the parietal region, in both of those regions, we see a strongly significant and positive correlation. So in other words, those participants that had the highest degree of task factorization, as demonstrated by kind of the orthogonality of these planes in neural space, they were also the ones that learnt the most effective category boundaries as defined by our measure of angle, the one that improves over the course of category boundary, that improves over the course of training. Okay, so I think that's essentially project one, and I think that what we've demonstrated is there are really two contributions of this project, which are to show, basically to elucidate two different ways in which you can solve this context-dependent decision task in a neural network, and to show that if we measure brain activity or behavior and brain activity from humans learning to perform this task, then we can see that the neural geometry as measured by BOLD really favors quite strongly in higher association cortex, favors quite strongly one of these learning schemes. And that's the one that has the advantage of being more robust, more tolerant to noise, and potentially better for generalization. But in the rest of my talk, what I'd like to do is to dig a little bit deeper into the second problem that I talked about, which is the problem of continual learning. And that's specifically how we can effectively learn one task, but then subsequently encountering another task, layer it on top of that learning without causing catastrophic interference. So a starting point for thinking about this is that effectively, if you think about the context-dependent task, if one was to learn one context and then another context, then effectively the problem faced by a neural network would be that you have to learn what is effectively like a discriminative model, like a supervised mapping in one context, and then in the other context, you have to learn a new supervised mapping without overwriting what you have previously learned. And this is, of course, this is the canonical way that the problem of continual learning is expressed. And this is a cartoon, but we know that broadly, behaviourally, if you do provide either humans or neural networks with tasks in this blocked fashion, so you kind of learn task A for a period of time, and then you learn task B for a period of time, and then you go back to task A, whereas humans will suffer some interference. In other words, when returning to task A, they won't do it quite as well as they were doing at the end of the first training session. They'll recover quite quickly and essentially suffer relatively little catastrophic interference. Whereas for neural networks, at least vanilla, we're thinking of a vanilla supervised setting here. The neural network will broadly have to relearn task A essentially from scratch after having been extensively trained on task B. So, you can think of, I don't know, maybe I learn Spanish on Tuesdays and I learn French on Wednesdays. And when it gets to Thursday, I've got my Spanish lesson. I, hope that I haven't overwritten all of my conjugations. So how do we do this? So we can think of two questions. So we can think of how biological systems do this, and we can think of how we can re-implement those computational mechanisms in AI in order to build systems capable of lifelong learning. And I think that, as nicely articulated in this this recent review from my colleague at DeepMind, Raya Hadsal, there are sort of broadly three classes of solution which are out there at the moment. And everything else is just some sort of wacky, as Timo says, some sort of wacky hybrid of these solutions. So broadly, we have solutions that depend on consolidation. So these are solutions in which, after learning task A, there is some sort of clever regularization which goes on, which essentially ensures that synapses, which are critically important for performing task A, essentially are kind of slowed down or frozen in some way, so that when we learn task B, we learn it with a new set of synapses, minimizing the extent to which task A is overwritten. So perhaps the best known example of this is a method which is alternately known as elastic weight consolidation or synaptic intelligence. Those two schemes both do basically the same thing. I think the major difference between them is that synaptic intelligence is a much better name, but broadly they're exactly the same. And we know that those schemes are reasonably effective in settings, in various toy settings, and even in things like learning successive Atari games using the a reinforcement learning framework. And that's work by Friedman Zenke and James Kirkpatrick. A second class of solution involves replay, and this, of course, has a venerable history, sort of going back to a theory which I think we should all still love, which is complementary learning systems theory, which basically proposes that one of the reasons why we have a hippocampus is because it allows us to engage in rapid learning of episodic information, which can then be gradually replayed back to the cortex in order to consolidate jointly those things which were learned at different times. So in other words, I've got it on my next slide. If I learn task A and then I learn task B, if I have some sort of storage and replay mechanism, then I can replay task A whilst I'm learning task B, thereby effectively interleaving the learning of the two tasks and preventing the catastrophic interference or overwriting, which would otherwise happen. And then the last class of solution, which I'm not going to talk about today, is meta-learning. I think meta-learning is an extraordinarily promising way of thinking about these problems, but that's out of scope for today's talk. A few years ago, Timo and I conducted a behavioral experiment in which we asked a very simple question, which was, if you take complementary learning systems theory seriously, then the reason why humans are really good at learning continually is because they're really good at interleaving. And what it predicts is that we should learn better under interleaved training conditions than under blocked training conditions. And so we tested that, and we did it in a very simple way using the trees task. So what we did was we took human participants. This was conducted over the internet in a large cohort of participants. It was more than 400 in total, and we did many experiments, and the effects I'm going to describe today are highly replicable. And what we did was we trained them under different conditions of blocking of the two contexts, and then we tested them in an interleaved setting. So just to be clear about what I mean by that, in the fully blocked condition, what they did was they saw a whole block. So this is several hundred trials of effectively the North Garden, and then several hundred trials of the South Garden. And then in the test phase, they received North and South Garden selected randomly and interleaved across trials. And we're going to compare that to a number of other conditions. Our key comparison is going to be full interleaving. So that's effectively where the training and test conditions are formally identical. There's no distinction between them. And we also had some kind of partial blocking conditions in which we actually originally we theorized that perhaps partial blocking might be a more effective way of training people than full blocking. Although, as you will see, that turned out not to be the case. So here's some behavioral data. So what I'm plotting on the left are the training data. And as you can see, in all conditions, participants improve over time. So what I call the B200 here is the fully blocked condition, and inter is interleaved. So in the fully blocked condition, obviously performance is better at training, as you might expect, because they're only doing one task rather than two. And that drops off. But what's of real interest is the performance at test. So remember, at test, the testing conditions were identical in all of these, for all of these participants that were, of course, trained in different groups. But what we see is that despite the fact that the blocked condition has the greatest disparity between training and test, that's the condition where people do best. And that's not what you would expect. So, for example, we know that, context effects in memory should lead us to believe that to the extent that training and test conditions are more similar, then people should do better. And that's exactly the opposite of what we see here. And there's actually the condition where they did worst was where we just interleaved. We literally had a turnabout scheme, but there was a significant advantage for blocking over interleaving. One thing that's particularly interesting, which I still fascinates me, is the fact that if you look, of course, this is a task now at test, we have what's effectively a task switching paradigm, because there are trials in which the context switches randomly and trials in which it remains the same. We can look at performance separately on those two different types of trial. And what we see is that under block 200, you still do better even on the even on the switch trials. That's the brown bar here. You still do better under blocked than under interleaved, even though people in the blocked condition have only experienced one switch trial throughout the entirety of training, where people in interleaved have experienced very many. And lastly, if we look at, just like we did in the data that I showed earlier, in this earlier experiment, if we look at what's improving over the course of training, it really is this learning of the category boundary, which is the main driver of performance. And we can see that, I'll come back to this later, but we can see that also in the choice matrices here, which are essentially, it's a bit difficult to see, but essentially the category boundary is more orthogonal under blocked training than it is under interleaved training on average. Okay, and we can also fit. So this is, sorry, I realize I'm short on time, so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly, but we can fit models of the choice probabilities in these choice matrices, and we can fit those that exhibit perfect factorization relative to another model here, which is just where a model which learns a single boundary, which would allow you to perform reasonably well on both tasks, but never to get 100%. And we can see that in the blocked training condition, there's a much better fit for this factorized model, and whereas under interleaved, there's a better fit for this sort of non-factorized model. This is the main result published in this, reported in this paper. So that's kind of fun, and humans do better under block training. But what I would like to do is I would like to use the neural theory that I introduced at the beginning of the experiment to ask the question of, how is it that we think that humans might actually benefit from block training? What's actually going on at the level of neural representation formation, which allows blocked training to supervene over interleaved training in biological agents? And how can we actually modify our neural networks so that they might do the same? And that's what I'm going to come to in my final few slides. So the key intuition driving this is that well, there's a number of different intuitions which are important, but the first one is to look at the types of neuronal selectivity which you get in your neural network in the hidden layer as a function of the two different tasks. So of course, sometimes that Mante task has been illustrated for the results, that the recordings from the prefrontal cortex of the monkeys have been used to support the idea that there is mixed or nonlinear mixed selectivity in the sense that there are neurons which code not just for one task or for the other, but for some kind of mixture of all the variables that might be relevant for performing the task. And so what we can do the same in our neural networks, and what we can do is we can characterize amongst the hidden units those units that respond best to task A or task B, or those units that display mixed selectivity. And what we see is that whereas if we start with the high norm solution, so this is lazy learning, we get a great deal of mixed selectivity. Actually, in the rich solution, we don't get that much mixed selectivity. We get some mixed selectivity, but we also get a sizable fraction of neurons that are responding to one task or another task. So effectively, what's happening is that the hidden units in this network under rich learning, so this is in interleaved training, I should just point out, just to make it clear. Under interleaved training, the neurons are effectively learning to partition the two tasks. So some hidden units are learning task A and some are learning task B. And you can see that down here, and I plotted just how we've averaged over those units which are characterized as responding to task A or task B. And you can see that they have the same sort of boundaries that we see in behavior. So how are these neural networks, how are these task selective units being formed? Well, it turns out that the key to how this partitioning of learning by the two tasks is going on comes from looking at the weights which link these context units to the hidden units. So the context input units, the ones that signal whether you are in a north garden or a south garden, which in our trees task was an image which showed whether it was sort of sunny or wintry. And the critical intuition here is that if you imagine that these weights here are projecting to hidden units which use a rectified linearity as their nonlinearity, so they're effectively using ReLUs, then the action of the ReLUs is going to be to zero out that portion of the input which lies below zero and effectively just set it to zero. So if you think about a projection which of the different stimuli in the two different contexts before the ReLU and after the ReLU, then you can see that before the ReLU you're going to get this grid, and after the ReLU the action of the ReLU is essentially going to be to compress everything onto the zero line. So what that means is that effectively, if we can learn weights from the context units to the hidden units, which are anti-correlated, then half of our hidden units are going to learn to perform task A, because everything below zero is going to get, essentially kicked out for them when they get one context. Basically, when they get one context input, everything's going to be below zero, so it's going to get essentially zeroed out. And in the other half of the units are going to learn primarily inputs from the other context unit. And that will happen only if and only if we can learn some sort of anti-correlation in the context units. And indeed, if we look at the distribution of correlations amongst these context units, so this is correlations among the weights from this unit coding for the North Garden to all the hidden units, and the South Garden to all the hidden units. If we look at those correlations after time for the task selective units, we can see that they are on average highly negative. So in other words, the network has learnt this solution under interleaved training of anti-correlated weights. So what we're going to do to try and model this is we're going to make two simple assumptions. So what we want to do is we want to build a neural network that is capable of doing this under blocked training. And the simple way that we're going to approach this problem is we're going to say, okay, well, we know that if we say we were able to handcraft those context weights as being anti-correlated, we would solve the problem. So how can we introduce another computational motif, which is going to encourage the network to learn anti-correlated context weights? So we're going to make two assumptions, and I hope these assumptions are uncontroversial. And what I'm going to show you in my last 2 minutes is that they allow us to solve the problem. So the first assumption is going to be that neurons are sluggish. And that simply means that the input at each time point is not going to be solely driven by the tree or the particular stimulus that occurred on that time point, but is going to involve some weighted fraction of the inputs from previous trials. And that's just saying that there's some sort of carryover interference, which you get from one trial to the next. And of course, we know that inevitably when we run experiments, we get history biases and sequential effects. So this is a highly uncontroversial assumption, I think. But the second assumption is that there's going to be some kind of Hebbian learning which accompanies the supervised learning at each time step. And that Hebbian learning is essentially going to serve the purpose of allowing, under blocked training, it's going to allow effectively an anti-correlation to emerge in those weights that are learnt in different time periods of the experiment. So in other words, if we have epoch 1 and epoch 2 that are separated in time, then effectively the Hebbian learning is going to encourage the network to learn anti-correlated patterns of weights at those two different epochs. And so effectively what we have going on in this network is two different update steps at the same time. So there's a supervised step, which is identical to in the vanilla neural network trained with gradient descent, supervision and gradient descent. But additionally, at each time step, we're going to have an unsupervised step, which is just this Hebbian, this Hebbian association. And then we're going to compare the choice matrices that we get both under blocked and interleaved training. And here's what we get. So we can see that for the vanilla neural network under interleaved training, of course, it does very well, which is what we would expect. But under blocked training, it suffers strong catastrophic interference. So in other words, the choice matrices simply reflect whatever the last task it was trained on. So here, the relevant dimension was the one on the y-axis, and it completely overwrote that for the other task. But what we can see is that this model, which we we call the sluggish SLA model because that's the name of the Hebbian update that we used. We can see that it broadly recapitulates the choice matrices that we see in humans. So first of all, we get more task factorization under blocked training than we do under interleaved training. And the reason why we get more, well, the reason why the network doesn't do so well under interleaved training is, of course, because of that sluggishness, right? The carryover. So we assume that, like humans, there's some sort of interference when you're doing context A and then context B and then context A again. You effectively have some kind of interference, which it basically dampens your ability to effectively partition learning in the two contexts. So we can fit, I haven't got it here, but we can fit these models to human data, and we can see that this sluggish model does a really good job. And not only does it do a really good job, but we can also see that, we can here effectively, using this Hebbian update step, we can solve the continual learning problem in the sense that we can avoid catastrophic interference. All right, so I just want to wrap up with one sort of conceptual point, and that's that, I think that for me, this work speaks to a broader theme, which is, I think, emerging in the work in our lab and I think elsewhere. And that's that, whilst we're very excited by neural networks, or particularly as deep networks trained with supervision as potential theories of how learning unfolds in biological systems, we also need to be a bit cautious. And I think, we also need to remember that during biological development, a stage at which information is provided in explicit form through explicitly taught learning, through, for example, in language acquisition or category acquisition, category learning, for example, that phase is preceded by a very long phase in which, infants just basically work out, what goes with what, right? So the fundamental problem of object recognition that is faced by all human infants is the problem of working out like what a thing is, right? So, if this is a thing, this red square, you need to work out that it's composed of two relevant dimensions, here, shape and color, and factorizing the world into those two different representations and understanding how the world is composed of the different input variables, essentially learning a good generative model of the world is, of course, a really good description of what goes on in the pre-linguistic phase of learning. And so, I would argue that when we consider biological solutions to problems like continual learning, it's going to be really important to think about a mixture of supervised training and the types of unsupervised training, as applied to simple objects like, red cubes, but also to more complex input spaces like these trees. And just one final result, and I promise I'm done, which is that we have some further evidence that this is actually really important. So going back to the 2018 data, one thing that we did was we actually asked participants, both prior and after the experiment, to we showed them a bunch of the trees that they were going to see in the experiment, and we asked them to arrange them in this arena. So just sort of drag and drop them into a space on the screen. And we asked them to arrange them in such a way that more similar trees were closer together. And so that allowed us to compute an RDM and to average our RDMs at the group level, or compute an RDM for each participant, and essentially to compute a measure, which we call the griddiness score, which is the extent to which the similarity structure that participants assumed in this arena task reflects the true one that we imposed as a ground truth of leafiness and branchiness when they actually did the experiment. And what we see is that those participants that had a higher griddiness score actually benefited more from block training. In other words, that there is a synergy between their prior, if you like, unsupervised factorization of the tree space into leafiness and branchiness and the extent to which they benefited from this kind of factorized training. Okay, and the last thing I want to say is really that, I think that there's a philosophy which goes on behind this work, and it's a philosophy which I owe as much to Andrew as to many other people in my lab as to anywhere else. And that's that, whilst we're very excited about deep learning as a theory, there's a tendency, I think, amongst some recent work to treat models from deep learning as kind of, to sort of blindly treat them as theories of what's going on in biological systems. So in other words, to say, well, look, deep learning is a black box, but we can sort of try to match the representations which we see in deep networks with those that we see, for example, in bold or in single cell neurophysiology and so on. And whilst, I, like everyone else, am excited by this project, I do think that it's important to take a pause. And I think that for example, the early part of my talk, I showed that you can get radically different representational schemes just by tweaking one very, very small variable, which is the initial weight scale in your neural network. And so, I think we need to be really cautious when sort of blindly trying to match neural networks to biological data. And the second lesson, I think, is that, rather than taking these huge, great state-of-the-art tools off the shelf and, just trying to sort of fit them to our data, we can really, I think, continue the project that was begun by the connectionist modelers, which is to use simpler neural networks and actually try to understand what they're doing. And I think, there's a really important neural theory project, which is to use, reductions or idealizations of neural networks to try to understand how humans and other animals learn. And just as a plug, Andrew and I tried to make this case in a more elaborate form in a recent paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, just came out. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Chris. This was a very, very enlightening talk. So we already have several questions. We have just a few minutes, so we can try to go in order of time. The first question that was asked was in the question and answer box from Sushrut Torat. With respect to the comparison between network weights and neural representations in the brain, do the representations in the hidden layer of the two networks with the different initializations actually look different? Maybe after transformation, the representations look similarly stretched, even if the weights in the high variance case are not structured similarly. Sorry, this was a long question.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's about whether there really is a correspondence between the different representational schemes predicted under rich and lazy learning and what we see in the brain. I think statistically the answer to that question is yes. So, you know, we can, I don't actually have, maybe I do. Do I have the slide? I may have a slide somewhere. Oh yeah, I do have this slide. So these are fits here of, so what we can do is we can take different brain regions. So this is early visual cortex and the two dorsolateral and parietal, and we can systematically vary our we can systematically vary the patterns of or basically the RDMs, which predict different forms of representation that we might see in bold, and we can vary them along two axes. So specifically here, we're varying the degree of compression. So that's, you know, as you go from a grid to a plane, right? And we can also vary the degree of rotation. So one thing that we actually thought might happen is that we thought that in the higher association regions, in particular, the representation might be rotated into a new frame of reference, which is sort of the frame of reference of plantiness. So we talk about leafiness and branchiness, but excuse me, of course, you know, participants ultimately have to make a response. And we thought that we might see the representation, rather than being kind of across, sort of rotated into this frame of reference, whereby sort of plant was up one end and don't plant was down the other end. And that would be predicted from, you know, some recent work by Silvia Bernardi and Dan Saltzman and Stefano Fusi, using a slightly different task, which they see a representation which looks a bit like that in monkey DLPFC. We don't see that. We actually do have some more neural theory, which I think explains why we don't see that. And it's to do with the fact that participants in our task, they didn't know whether plant was going to map onto a right-hand response or a left-hand response. And that was actually only revealed to them as each trial happened. But broadly, what these plots show is that in both parietal and DLPFC, we see basically lots of compression, that's lots on the y-axis, and no rotation. So I think, you know, quantitatively, if I've understood the question correctly, there is just a really good fit of that orthogonal planes model.
Cool. Okay, thank you. So we have another question from the chat box from Yul Kang. In the solutions to continual learning, sluggish SLA interleaved seems to show the opposite bias to humans. So for example, an R brighter in row 2, column 1, as opposed to humans in column 1, row 3. What's your explanation for this?
So are we talking about this slide here? Well, I guess that the speak is a bit difficult for this questioner to ask. So I'm going to try to interpret the question in the way that I understood it. I'm not sure I fully understood it, but if it was pertaining to this slide, then unless I've messed something up, then, oh yeah, I have messed something up. It's because I put these the wrong way around. Okay, so that's what happens when you finish off your slides at 11 o'clock before to give a talk at 12:30. My sincere apologies. But these two plots on the bottom here for humans should be swapped over. So sluggish LSLA looks like that one. I just got the category boundaries the wrong way around. So I think that probably answers the question.
Okay, so we have another question from Christian Buck-Calderon. Do similar results emerge in the case of sigmoidal activation function rather than ReLU?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I think they would actually, because, you know, coupled with a bias, effectively you could learn, right? So the sigmoidal activation function, you could use the lower portion of it, and it's basically just like a sort of soft ReLU, right? I'm pretty sure that we've done that, at least for some of the analyses, and I'm 99% sure that we get almost identical results. I understand also the provenance of the question, because we don't have a ReLU is a non-differentiable function that we don't actually have in the brain, right? So it's important to show that these results generalize. The reason I illustrate it with a ReLU is because it makes the explanation much more intuitively easy to understand.
Okay, so I'm trying to get questions both from the question and answer and the chat, and I'm going by time, so I'm sorry if I don't manage to read them all. But so there is another question from Yul Kang. Would you please elaborate more on what you mean by Hebbian learning in Project 2? Specifically, what are the associations that are learned? Is it between stimuli or between the stimuli and task or something else?
It's between the stimuli and the hidden units, effectively. So effectively, if you have strong input at the stimulus layer, and that evokes a strong input at the hidden layer, then there's effectively a Hebbian step. There are some subtleties. So there's a normalization in the Hebbian step, which actually normalization, even without Hebbian learning, under some circumstances but not others, gives you a similar result. So it may just be that literally just centering things actually gives you enough kind of enough of a distance in neural space to separate the relevant representations. Yeah, so as you can imagine, if things are correlated in time, particularly with our sluggishness, right, then what that's going to mean is that you've essentially got one set of units, right, which when you're getting constant input from that context unit, right, the relationship between that context unit and all of those activations is going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And then suddenly you switch to a new block and you get a different context unit, right? And just by chance, some of those other context units are going to be negatively activated with the first one and positively with the second one, right? And so when that happens, those are going to grow and grow and grow and grow, but not the other ones. So you're effectively going to learn anti-correlated ones. That's why it works.
Okay, so we are running out of time. I think we should end here. Thank you very much for the talk and the answers, Chris.
Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you everyone for your questions.
Thank you. All right.
As everyone is leaving, I just wanted to direct your attention, Chris, to the unanswered Q&A and chat questions, because I'm not sure they're going to stay when. Yeah. And
I was just wondering if there's a way. Yeah, I'm just going to copy them, actually.
I was trying to copy them out too. I can't quite figure out how to do it. But
I can probably manage to do that. So I can stop sharing. Is it okay to stop sharing, I guess, now?
Yes.
And let me see. Yeah, got them. Cool. Well, I'll.
Did you also catch the ones that were in the chat box?
Oh, let me see.
I think those were asked, actually.
All of them?
I'll note them down just in case.
Yep.
Yeah, there was a small detail at the very beginning at 158 in neural network slide, rightmost panel. I think that there is some labels that are switched or something. Somebody pointed something out.
Undoubtedly. I will go through my my slides. Yeah, I mean, I wrote this talk just specifically for this business, so it's a new talk.
No, but
so
it's
very nice to road test it.
Thank you so much again, Chris, for joining us.
Thank you, Laura.
And let us know if there's anything we can help in the afternoon with the handover.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.